Hello, and welcome to Atypical Development of Speech and Language Skills and Its Impact on Learning. I'm Dana Vermilia from Blast Intermediate Unit 17 and glad to be with you. Today we're going to talk about the areas of speech and language, typical speech and language development, the foundations for learning, and the impact of when typical development does not occur. We're going to start, and a lot of what we're going to do in this session is just take a deeper dive into what is typical development of speech and language skills. And I think you'll understand why that impacts learning so much when it's atypical once you see what all that involves. There are many, many areas covered in the development of speech and language skills. Some of those include, but this is not an exhaustive list. Some of them are articulation and phonology or phonological skills, morphology, pragmatics, phonological awareness, concepts, pronouns, vocabulary, questions, listening, reading, and writing. So now we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into most of those. When we think about our phonemes, there are sounds that we say. We have typical development for articulation and phonology. Phonemes do develop at different ages. When you think about kids, think about a 2-year-old talking versus a 5-year-old talking, right? This is just a snapshot of some of those developmental skills for articulation sounds. You'll see that the P, B, and M, the P, B, and M, are the first to develop. They are developed by 3 years of age. When you skip down a little ways, you'll see that certain sounds don't develop till closer to 4. For some children have them anyway, but like K and G come along a little bit later. And then if you keep going, you'll find your S and Z or S and Z come along a little bit later. Your R sounds are one of the later developing, and then those clusters where we have blending of two sounds together, those come in, those are some of the latest to develop. So thinking about that, it's okay for children to speak with sound errors, but typically we understand what they're saying, right, by a certain age because they're consistent errors. Take a minute and think about a child that you know and their sound development. I can think about my oldest son when he was developing his sounds. One of the sounds he did not have was F. That F sound was developing for him right on track, really. It was not delayed, but he wasn't using it. And I was starting to wonder, should he have this sound by now, right? And then one day we modeled, my mother said, say fox, for example, and he got it. And just from that day on, he had that F. You'll also find sometimes you'll have children that say some sounds in words in error, but then once that sound comes in, they say the sound correctly. So sometimes when we learn words prior to the development of the sound, we maintain those errors a little bit longer because it's really just a habit. I always tell students it's like retraining your brain. You have to repractice those habits when you're developing and working on sounds. When we stick with that articulation and phonological patterns area, the phonological patterns also develop at certain stages. So you might not have heard of most of these, but some of these processes are expected to be present or not present. When we think about a whole word, we see younger children delete that unstressed syllable. And the final consonant deletion and things like that, those are disappearing by age 3. When you're wondering, if you might be wondering what is unstressed syllable deletion, that's like when we have banana and kids are saying nana instead of banana, right? Final consonant deletion, where we leave that final consonant sound off. Velar fronting is moving some of those sounds toward the front, like t instead of k, things like that. Consonant assimilation, where we might take the sound at the beginning of the word or at the end of the word and also say it again in the opposite position because it blends in, right? Um, an example of that would be when students say tat instead of cat. That's an example of that. We also have reduplication. That's when we hear young children saying like baba instead of bottle. So those are all examples of those phonological process or phonological patterns and processes that are really starting to disappear by the age of 3. Some of those that hang around longer and we see them disappearing after the age of 3 are things like cluster reduction. So that's where we have those two sounds together, like the word clean, they might just say keen, right? Because we're leaving that L out. Epenthesis, which is when we add in an So, for example, if we have the word black, we might say black, right? That's adding in that somewhere. Gliding is when we have that W for an R, for example, like instead of red, we might say wed. And stopping is when we take a sound that should be continuant, like a s, and we add it, we substitute it rather with a stopping sound like d or t. So maybe instead of sun, we say ton. So some of these processes do disappear after the age of 3, but still, most of them are starting to disappear, by 6, things like that. A couple of them with like the R's and whatnot might hang around a little bit longer. When we think about our speech intelligibility and pronoun use and morphology, really by the age of 5, a child should be 90 to 100% intelligible. And when I say that, that is to a stranger. Somebody who does not know the student should be able to understand 90 to 100% of what they're saying. That doesn't mean they don't have any articulation errors, but they're consistent so you know what they're saying. There's no clear-cut acquisition of pronouns, but by the age of 4, children are typically using most pronouns correctly. There's a little bit of, again, there's no clear cut structure, but most people agree that I is one of the first pronouns used. And I think that's one of the things we're seeing a big shift in. I'm seeing many, many students that have difficulty with their pronoun use. We're seeing them say like me or my instead of I. We're seeing them use her and him instead of he and she in the beginning of sentences. So that's something that for sure impacts our students, and that seems to be a shift that we're seeing right now. Now, by the age of 5, children are typically using ing, like running, right? They are also typically using regular plurals, regular past tense, some irregular past tense and plurals, some irregular past tense, articles, those irregular third person singular past tense verbs like be verbs, and so much more beyond that. But when we think about that, sometimes we think, wow, they're just 5, so we shouldn't expect these things, right? And again, we're going to meet the students where they're at, but just so you know, a typical developing speech and language skills should be showing most of these things by the age of 5. Children should also be able to speak in more than 4-word utterances by the age of 5. That comes into our morphology. So typically, if we're only using 1 and 2 words still, then there's somewhat of a delay. We should be able to use 4+ word utterances. Now, coming into our phonological awareness. Phonological awareness is a huge predictor of reading skills. In fact, I haven't looked at the research recently on this, but some time ago, the research was really showing that your phonological awareness skills was a better predictor of reading skills than anything else, including your socioeconomic status or any other impacts that might weigh in there on your literacy skills. Phonological awareness is the ability to manipulate the structure of an utterance independently from its meaning. So this is when we're taking sounds, syllables, or words and manipulating them. You might see syllable segmentation. So we're taking a word and we're dividing it into its number of syllables, right? Remember doing that? And I don't know about you, but when I was in school, we used to clap them out for how many syllables were in there. Syllable blending, so taking two syllables and blending them together. Rhyming, play those rhyming games with students. Give me a rhyming word. It's okay if it's nonsense words when you're rhyming, but rhyming is a huge piece of phonological awareness skills. Phoneme isolation, so being able to separate like cat into k, at, right? Final alliteration, and that's identifying a word that ends in a specific given sound, like find the word that ends with a k. And I think I might have skipped initial alliteration, which is the same thing, but finding the word that starts with that sound. Sound blending. So when you have these sounds, k, at, what word do you hear? So being able to put those together. Sound deletion. So when we take a word and we say the word cup, now say it again without the k, up would be the word you have left. Sound substitution. So take a word, take cat, now say it again, but change the k to an mat, right? And sound grapheme matching. So what letter says k? What letters say, anything like that, any of the sounds. All of those are huge pieces for developing those reading and literacy skills. So they might be things that you can work into fun games, or, even if your students aren't verbal, you might find ways that they can do some of those activities with pointing skills, right, to show what they know. That brings us to our concepts. Basic concept understanding begins at 1 to 2 years of age. Think about that. Think about your students and how quickly they start as children. Maybe you know some young children right now. Maybe you are thinking back to your own children and their development. Maybe you have children in this stage right now. But at what stage do they start understanding up or in or on, right? So this is beginning at 1 to 2 years of age, that in, on, up, down. That understanding continues to develop. At between 2 and 3 years of age, a number concept understanding starts to develop. Time concepts of soon, later, and wait begin to develop. Think about that. Our children start understanding wait by the time they're 3. We can see that students can select 3 that are the same or one that is not identical by this age. They can match 1 to 1 at this age. So that matching 1 to 1 is between 3 to 4 years. So that's a little bit later, but still very early. When we get to 4 to 5 years, we're seeing some understanding of comparative and superlative adjectives. And then at 5 to 6 years, we're seeing a lot really blossom. They're understanding those opposites, on, off, right? Top, bottom. Understanding number concepts up to 20. Understanding comparative adjectives. And they're showing understanding of those ordinal numbers like first, second, third. So think about that. That's all by the age of 6. Just for clarification, if you're not 100% sure of those comparative and superlative adjectives, there are big, bigger, biggest, and things like that. So all of these things are happening basically by the time our students are entering kindergarten, if we stop and think about that. They're developing all of these skills. They have some of this understanding. But I bet if you stop and think about it, and I'll ask you to take a minute and do that, you'll be able to think of one student at least right away that doesn't have some of these skills. Think about that student and what you see them doing or struggling with. When we come into questions, questions are necessary to be able to seek and relay information as well as navigate a conversation. If you look back through your communication, typically the communication that we did, it's easiest to look back through text messages, right? If you looked back through your text messages, I bet if you looked at your last 5 messages sent, very few of them would be requests, which is what we sometimes focus on with our students who are nonverbal or struggling with speech and language skills. And at least one of them would be a question, I bet. Maybe not if you were already in the middle of a conversation, but typically there are questions involved. Our students really begin answering questions like where by pointing, what's this, and some yes no questions by the age of 3. They choose an object intentionally when we say, do you want this, right? Or this, right? Do you want juice or milk? Do you want the bunny or the kitten toy? Things like that. They can answer some can you questions. And they answer those simple WH questions like, what is that? Who is this? Those sorts of things. By the age of 4, they answer when and how many questions. So think about that. Again, all of that is happening before they come to school in typical development. When we think about asking questions, I apologize. My last slide should have said answering questions when we talk about answering questions. This one is asking questions. By the age of 3, they will ask, what's that? They will ask where, what, and what doing questions. By the age of 4, they ask those one-word why questions. So think about that stage when you are, especially if you're on a car ride with a child and they're doing that why, right? Think about that why stage. They use what, where, when, how, and whose when they're asking questions. They can ask is questions. They can invert the auxiliary and subject, such as where is mom going? And they use correct grammar when asking, like those early infinitives, do you want to? So that, again, is all happening before their school age. Think about all of this, all of these things that just naturally are occurring because we're providing these examples when we're talking to children. They're hearing it, they're picking up on it, and they're starting to do it. Next, we're going to move into listening. Listening is not the same as hearing. Listening is the ability to attend to and process what is heard. Listening is a key component in speech and language, in social and academic development. By the age of 3, children are able to discriminate speech from non-speech. They recognize voices. They move their eyes in the direction of a sound. They stop an activity when their name is called. They're able to respond to simple requests and directions, understand simple questions, and listen to simple stories. And some of these things develop in the first year, right? But I just grouped them like 3, under 3, over 3 kind of things because that was a little bit easier for our purposes. From ages 3 to 5, they respond to their name being called from another room. They understand most simple questions. They begin to learn from listening at this point in the game. They can remember up to 4 digits when they're given slowly, and they can repeat sentences up to 9 words in length quite often. I would say simple sentences, not big, huge, difficult words. And they're able to follow some 3-step directions. So that's another one. Think about students you're interacting with and how they're able to follow directions or where they struggle. Do they struggle with 1 step, 2-step, 3-step, more than that? When we say 3-step, it's typically, again, 3-step simple directions. When we get a lot of modifiers and things like that, and they're like, before you do this, then that becomes more difficult. Um, but those stand up, walk to the door, and let in the person there, that would be something that they would be able to follow. When you think about listening, do you see areas where you feel like children are struggling? Think about that for a minute. Are those areas that you're thinking that listening struggles occur some of the ones that I talked about here? When we get into reading, literacy development begins at birth, just like language development. It's imperative that we give children the opportunity to experience reading books and things like that, and interacting with them in their world. Children begin with literacy skills and build those skills as they develop and grow. The earliest stages include exploring books through touch, looking at pictures, chewing on them, and patting them. And I do apologize for any typos I have in my slides. I will correct them before I share them, so hopefully they'll be corrected for you. So think about babies and looking at the pictures, chewing on their board books, touching them, feeling them, right? That progresses into listening to stories for longer periods of time, a couple minutes at a time, and then that continues to grow. Attending to books and holding books. By a pretty early age, we see children holding books properly. Then we see them paying attention to specific print, like letters and a name. We see a difference in writing as they're trying to write versus draw or scribble. We see them read stories to themselves. Right? We see them holding those books. Children start playing those rhyming games. Remember when I talked about how important those phonological awareness skills are? We see our students, as they develop, start playing those rhyming games. That we see them starting some of those letter-like forms. They're starting to write those shapes instead of just scribbles randomly. We see the understanding of a story sequence is being demonstrated, and more letter-like formations are being used. We also see the students recognizing letters and sounds, and we see them attempting to read and sound out words, and start spelling words as they're sounding them out, spelling them how they sound. And as they continue to grow, this is all of these things are happening by the end of first grade. And at the end of first grade, students often have a sight word vocabulary of 100 words, and they understand what they're reading. So that's really key as well. We just talked about listening and reading. It's key to understand that in language, there are two different areas of language that we sometimes talk about, and that's receptive language and expressive language. Our receptive language is what we take in and process. Our expressive language is what we express to you. So a lot of what we talked about, the sound production, the sentence length and things like that, that's all expressive language. Our speaking is one form of expressive language. Well, reading and listening are the two forms of receptive language that we have and develop. Our other form of expressive language is writing. So writing and speaking are the two forms of expressive language that we often use. When it comes to writing, a child's ability to hold writing tools develops as they grow, just like their ability to write does. So when we think about it, right, we see them with that whole fist. As they get better, they improve that pincer grasp, right, and then the pencil. We can get them to hold the pencil properly. Once that's strengthened a little bit. So students progress also as they're writing from scribbling to writing some letters. So we think about the scribbling that we see, just the random. Then we see some of those circles. We might see lines. We might see T's, right, or crosses, things like that, plus sign type crosses. They write words by sounding them out, and then they learn the spelling rules, right? So we start out, we're sounding out the words, so I'm going to write it how it sounds. Then I learn the spelling rules and what sounds make what um, following in those spelling rules. So I learn more about how to spell the words the correct way. We see them begin using capital letters and punctuation through this process as well. So, we don't automatically use capital letters, or sometimes kids are taught to write in capitals. Some schools don't typically do that, but sometimes families do, right? So they might write in all capital letters. And then we might see that go to lowercase, right? But then we see them start learning that at the beginning of my sentence, I need a capital. On a name, I need a capital. We see them start using periods. After periods, we see them start using other types of punctuation, like marks and exclamation points and question marks. And the ability to print letters clearly also increases, right? As those fine motor skills continue to develop, we see that ability to write a little more clearly also develop. I know this is one of those hard things, that clarity of writing, because that's something, it doesn't matter if you have delays or not. Sometimes your writing is not real legible, right? But when we think about that, as your skills develop, your ability to write a little clearer also develops. Where do you see students breaking down in their writing? Think about that for a minute. Next, we're going to move into what happens when typical development does not occur. When typical development does not occur, students are not able to access their environment in the same manner. Think about all of the areas we just talked about and what that impacts when it comes to learning. If articulation is delayed, your spelling may be impacted. So when we have those errors in articulation, sometimes students carry that into their spelling. Sometimes they don't. That just depends on the student. But that can be one of the things that we see if articulation is delayed. If language is delayed, access to reading and understanding may be impacted. So when we think about that, we're thinking about the fact that if I can't understand all of those language pieces, when we talked about that phonological awareness, right? If I don't understand all of those pieces, I might not be able to learn how to read at the same rate as my peers. I might not understand directions the same way. I might not be able to interact and answer questions or ask the questions I need to gain more knowledge in the areas where I'm struggling. If language is delayed, math word problems can be very difficult to understand, or even just the directions in any task, but in math tasks in any class might be difficult to process and understand. If language is delayed, our social emotional skills may be impacted. That means I might not be able to express my emotions. Think about a student that you know that has language delays and has trouble expressing their emotions. What do they typically do instead? How do you know how they're feeling? If I have speech and language delays, I might not be able to build relationships with other people. Think about how much communication is a piece of a relationship. If I can't introduce myself, if I can't ask somebody, that doesn't mean you have to be able to verbalize, right? Some of our individuals that are nonverbal and use augmentative communication can still build relationships. It's not that I can't do it, but how that needs to happen might look very differently. In general, having speech and language delays can certainly impact all areas of learning. In what area of learning, especially when we're talking about learning in a school, what area does not involve communication? Right? As teachers, they're standing in front of a class and they're presenting information. They're asking for reassurance that the students are following them. They're giving directions they expect to be followed so students can show what they know. Students are writing answers. They're reading. They're speaking. They're listening. When we have a breakdown in those areas, that can impact what I'm able to take in, what I'm able to process, and what I'm able to give as output. So, can my students develop these skills if they're not typically developing? Yes, they can. That development might occur at a different rate. It might occur in different stages, but we have to think about that. A great example is a nonverbal student. They didn't go through those babbling stages, right? All of those same stages of development. So maybe when I'm first giving some kind of support for communication, I need to think about the fact that they might have to go through those stages of development to a certain degree. We can't just expect them to go from being non-communicator in the sense of using a form of augmentative communication and using like words in that sense or messages in that sense to putting full sentences together, right? We don't see that happen in typical development. We see one word, then we see after several one-word utterances a combination of words, then we see sentences and things like that. So it can develop, but you might see some of those stages. You might see not quite all of those stages. It can still occur even if my student has a complex body. Again, some of our students can't write with their hand because they have complex bodies. They might not speak. They might not be able to interact with books the same way that we interact with books because they can't hold them up. All of those different things, right? But that doesn't mean that they can't develop the ability to read or the ability to formulate messages in some kind of written form. We have things like alternative pencils that we allow students to use. It might be through eye gaze, it might be through pointing. Whatever the case may be, where letters are involved, so they can still learn some of that spelling piece, even if they can't write. Some students can type, but they can't use a pencil. All of those things we have to take into account. Development can occur even if our students have complex learning needs. So our students that are involved still need to be given the opportunity to learn academics. We still need to be doing math instruction. We still need to be doing literacy instruction, because even if with complex learning needs and complex bodies, we can still see students learn and develop the abilities. Some individuals are kind of trapped in their bodies. While my body doesn't work, my brain does. And I have a lot of knowledge and I can do these things. I've known individuals who had very complex bodies. I knew a man who used a head pointer to access his communication device and his computer and his phone. He'd gone to graduate school. He had to have care in the fact of he had to have a home health aide to support him in his dressing and eating and toileting and all of those things, because he couldn't do any of those things independently, but he could still read. He graduated from a graduate program in college. So we cannot just assume that they don't have these abilities based on their body and how they're presenting. We need to presume the competence. We need to give the students the opportunity to learn. We need to provide explicit instruction. We need still to have that exposure to language. That's why we talk about inclusion so much, being included and exposed to the vocabulary and the opportunities and the regular peers is so beneficial for developing those language skills. We need to provide opportunities for the learners. We need to meet them where they're at. We need to provide the opportunities so that they can have the practice and the time to practice and the time to interact. And we need to take that and build upon that. So your role in that is to support that. You know what your students are being taught, and it's your role then to reinforce that, right? Give them those extra opportunities, because quite often you're the ones with the students more frequently sometimes than any specific teacher. So you can give them those opportunities to be exposed repeatedly to the topics that have been introduced to them. You can give them the practice opportunities just by being caring, being patient, talking to them just like you would talk to anybody else that's their age, and really meeting them where they're at. It's just so important to provide those opportunities for our students because they can learn. But again, our speech and language development does impact our access and how much we can understand so much. As you keep that in mind, if you have further questions, you can contact me. Here's my contact information. But spend some time thinking about it. Take a few minutes now as you end the video and think about what you see with the students you interact with, and there may be any delays they might have in that speech and language development and how that might have impacted a different piece of their learning that maybe you didn't stop and think about before. But also think about where are their strengths. What do you see them doing well? And how can you use that to build some of the areas that aren't as strong? What are some ideas that you can maybe use for practice skills where you can build upon what they're already good at to help strengthen some of those areas that aren't as strong. Thanks for joining us.